Okay, so you want to own a brewery. Picture the stainless steel catching late afternoon light through a garage door propped open with a keg. Picture the hiss of a tap handle pulling forward, foam curling over the rim of a glass with your logo on it. Picture regulars who know your name, leaning on the bar on a Friday night just to say, "the usual," and your name going up in vinyl letters over a door that used to belong to a tire shop. That's the fantasy, and it's a good one. Now picture 11:40 on a Tuesday night when the walk-in cooler compressor finally dies and takes 14 kegs of unsold seasonal ale down with it, oxidized past drinkable before anyone notices the temperature climbing. Picture a distributor invoice for freight charges nobody explained when you signed the contract. That's the picture that actually shows up in your inbox. According to the Brewers Association, craft beer in the United States was a $28.8 billion industry in 2024, spread across 9,578 operating breweries. And the strange part is how little that giant number has to do with whether any single one of them makes money. What actually decides your fate isn't the size of the market. It's the gap between what a barrel earns poured across your own bar and what the same barrel earns once it leaves the building in a truck you don't own. The real question isn't whether people will drink your beer. It's who ends up owning the thing that's actually worth owning once the beer stops being the point. And the answer has almost nothing to do with the beer. There's also the matter of what's underneath the building itself, which turns out to matter more than almost anything else here. That comes later because it's where a serious share of the real money in this industry quietly hides. A brewery is not one business, it's three, and each one is a completely different bet. Door one is the production brewery, a company that brews at real scale, cans or bottles it, and sells almost all of it through the three-tier system, the post-prohibition legal structure requiring beer to pass from brewer to a licensed distributor to a retailer before it ever reaches a customer, because lawmakers in the 1930s decided that letting one company control all three tiers was exactly how the old saloon system got out of hand in the first place. Door one owners rarely meet the people drinking their beer. Door two is the taproom first model. Most of what gets brewed never leaves the building. Revenue comes across the bar directly from the person drinking it in the same room where it was made. Door three barely needs a brewhouse at all. It's contract brewing, paying for someone else's tanks and someone else's federal brewing permit to physically produce beer under your own label. Sometimes formalized as an alternating proprietorship, an arrangement where two or more companies legally share the same equipment on a rotating schedule so a second brand can exist without a second mortgage. This is the story of Door two, mostly because it's the door most owners actually picture when they picture a brewery in the first place. But hold on to this. Door two has a habit of quietly turning its owners into landlords, whether they planned on it or not. And that's going to matter a great deal more than the beer itself. The price of admission for Door two breaks down into a handful of blunt, unavoidable numbers, and it helps to walk through them in order because each one gates the next. First, the brewhouse itself, the tanks, the mash system, the control panel that turns grain and water into wort. For a modest 10-barrel system, a barrel being the industry's standard unit at 31 gallons, that equipment alone runs somewhere between $135,000 and $170,000 installed. Second, fermentation. You need somewhere for the wort to actually become beer and somewhere for it to clarify afterward. A bank of fermenters and bright tanks that, for a small operation, adds somewhere between $75,000 and $95,000 on top of the brewhouse. Third, packaging and cellar equipment. A canning line, a glycol chiller, a keg washer, and the kegs themselves. Somewhere between $100,000 and $130,000, and none of it optional if you plan to sell beer outside the building. Fourth, the tap room itself. The bar, the seating, the draft lines running through the wall, the leasehold improvements a landlord will make you pay for even though the building isn't yours. Somewhere between $105,000 and $135,000. Fifth, the paperwork. The federal side is almost deceptively cheap. The TTB, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, charges no application fee at all for the brewer's notice. The federal permit every commercial brewery is legally required to hold before producing a drop. It does, however, require a surety bond from an approved bonding company before you're allowed to operate. States charge their own fee on top of that. Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission records, for example, list a 2-year in-state brewing license at $3,000, plus another $1,200 if you want the right to self-distribute, selling directly to bars and stores instead of going through a wholesaler. Added up, equipment, build-out, licensing, and enough cash on hand to survive a slow first few months of payroll before revenue catches up, and the realistic number to open the doors on a small taproom-forward brewery lands somewhere between $1.1 million and $1.3 million. That's the number nobody puts on the thumbnail. Here's the trap. Opening day isn't the finish line. It's the starting gun for a set of recurring costs that never announce themselves the way a purchase order does. Start with the federal excise tax, which sounds like a footnote until you actually run it. A small brewer producing under 2 million barrels a year pays what's known as the small brewer excise rate, a discounted $3.50 per barrel, but only on the first 60,000 barrels. Every barrel above that threshold, and every barrel for a genuinely large brewer, gets taxed at $16 a barrel up to 6 million barrels and $18 a barrel past that. Grow too successfully, in other words, and the tax code itself starts working against the thing that made you money in the first place. Then there's the recurring operating burden that has nothing to do with beer quality at all. Payroll for a lean brewing and taproom crew runs somewhere between $21,000 and $25,000 a month before anyone pours a single pint. Rent on the building sits somewhere between $5,000 and $7,500 a month, whether the tanks are full or empty. Raw ingredients, malt, hops, yeast, cost somewhere between 65 and 85 cents for every pint poured across the bar, and packaging losses from spoiled or mishandled product quietly eat into revenue every single batch, whether anyone notices or not. Now, here's where it gets dangerous. Remember the 3-tier system from a few minutes ago? In most states, once a brewery signs with a distributor, state franchise laws, statutes written specifically to make firing a bad distributor extraordinarily difficult and expensive, mean that relationship is essentially permanent, even if the distributor is doing a visibly poor job selling your beer in the territory you agreed to. A handful of states allow limited self-distribution instead, but step past the capped volume the law allows, and a brewery lands right back inside the same 3-tier system, permanently, by law. A savings account pays more than some of these breweries manage in their first 2 years, and the ingredients were never really the problem. None of that means the money isn't real. It just means it shows up in layers, and the order matters. The first and most obvious layer is the tap room itself. Beer sold directly across your own bar, where a barrel brings in somewhere between $900 and $1,100 in revenue, with a gross margin somewhere between $700 and $850 on that same barrel, because there's no distributor and no retailer taking a cut in between. The second layer is wholesale distribution. The same beer sold through the 3-tier system to bars, restaurants, and grocery stores an owner will probably never set foot in. That same barrel now brings in somewhere between $275 and $325, with a gross margin somewhere between $130 and $170. Roughly the same beer, roughly a fifth of the money. The third layer is merchandise and events. Hats, glassware, private taproom rentals for birthdays and rehearsal dinners. A smaller line, but one with almost no cost of goods attached to it at all. The fourth layer, and the one almost nobody budgets for on day one, is the keg deposit, a refundable charge collected on every keg shipped out, which functions less like a sale and more like a small interest-free loan held until the empty steel makes its way back. It isn't revenue, it's float, and a growing brewery ends up holding a meaningful amount of it at any given moment without ever really noticing. None of these four layers, on their own, explain why one brewery down the street is thriving, while another one, with objectively better beer by most local accounts, quietly closed last year. According to the Brewers Association, 529 U.S. breweries closed in 2024 against only 430 that opened, the first year since 2005 that closures outran openings nationwide. Add those four revenue layers together across nearly 9,800 breweries fighting for the same bar stools, and the category still pulled in $28.8 billion at retail. So far, that makes a brewery sound like a machine that quietly turns grain into money. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the layer that actually decides whether an owner gets rich isn't listed above it all, and it has almost nothing to do with how good the beer tastes. The part nobody tells you is that the beer was always the bait. Look again at that gap between the two channels, somewhere between $700 and $850 of margin per barrel poured across your own bar, against somewhere between $130 and $170 per barrel sold through a distributor. That gap isn't really a beer margin, it's a hospitality margin, the same kind a restaurant or a bar captures by controlling the room where the product gets consumed instead of just supplying the product itself. The brewery that survives isn't the one that makes the best beer. It's the one that runs the taproom well enough to keep pulling people back through a door that happens to sit next to some very expensive stainless steel. Read that again. The room is the business. The beer is what gets people to walk into the room. That's the real money room, but it isn't the deepest one. Once a brewery is pulling a meaningful share of its revenue through its own taproom instead of a distributor, it isn't really operating like a beverage company anymore. It's operating like a real estate and hospitality company that happens to also brew its own inventory, which raises an obvious question nobody puts on the label. Who actually owns the building? The taproom sits inside, and what happens to that value once the beer business itself is worth less than the dirt underneath it? That's not a hypothetical. That's the deepest room in this industry, and it doesn't show up in a single number discussed so far. Not the CapEx, not the margins, not the excise tax. It shows up later, on a deed, usually years after a founder stopped thinking about beer as the point of the business at all. Anchor Brewing Company spent over a century proving exactly how far a brand can travel on beer alone, and exactly how little that protects an owner once the beer stops being enough. How does a business that basically invented an entire American industry not survive it? Anchor Brewing Company is the clearest life arc this business has to offer, mostly because it ran for so long that every stage happened in slow motion. It was founded in San Francisco in 1896, survived the earthquake and fires of 1906, and limped through Prohibition and multiple ownership changes before Fritz Maytag, yes, of the appliance family, bought a controlling 51% stake in 1965 for what's been described only as a few $1,000s, because at the time, nobody wanted a struggling regional brewery that looked more like a hobby than a business. Maytag rebuilt it into the brand that essentially invented the modern American craft beer movement, the reference point every artisanal brewery since has been chasing, whether its owners know it or not. Production climbed for decades, peaking at roughly 132,000 barrels in 2013, making Anchor one of the largest, genuinely independent craft breweries left in the country. Then the ownership changes started again. Griffin Group, a firm tied to Sky Vodka executives, bought in during 2010. In 2017, Sapporo Breweries, a Japanese beverage conglomerate, acquired Anchor outright for $85 million, a price that looked at the time like validation. It wasn't. Distribution priorities shifted, sales slid, and on July 12, 2023, Sapporo announced Anchor Brewing would cease operations entirely, filing the 60-day notice required before mass layoffs and closing a 127-year-old business inside a matter of weeks. Workers tried to organize a cooperative buyout. It didn't happen fast enough. The brand sat dormant for nearly a year before Chobani founder Hamdi Ulukaya announced in May 2024 that he'd acquired it with plans to reopen, and as of the most recent public update, the new ownership had secured its state alcohol permit but had not yet resumed production, more than a year after the announcement. Anchor survived 2 world wars, Prohibition, and the earthquake that leveled San Francisco in 1906. It did not survive 1 acquisition and 1 balance sheet decision made on another continent. 127 years gone inside a 60-day notice period. Trace the money 1 level deeper, and here's the answer that's been waiting since the beginning. The one about who actually ends up owning the thing worth owning once the beer itself stops being the point. It's the building, and it's the exit. Victory Brewing Company, a well-established craft operation based in Pennsylvania, sold the real estate under its 212,000-square-foot production facility to Fortress Investment Group for $21,790,000 in February 2024. A sale-leaseback, meaning Victory handed over the deed and immediately signed a long-term lease to keep operating inside the exact same building. The beer business kept running exactly as before. What changed was who owned the concrete underneath it, and roughly $22 million moved onto the brewery's balance sheet in exchange for a document guaranteeing Victory could keep brewing there for years to come. That's not a beer transaction. That's a real estate transaction wearing a brewery's clothes. The other exit is consolidation. Through the 2000s and 10s, Anheuser-Busch InBev's high-end division went shopping across the craft industry, acquiring independent breweries including Golden Road, Wicked Weed, and 10 Barrel, not primarily for their tanks, but for their brand equity and their existing shelf space inside a distribution network that would have taken any of them a decade to build alone. The company paused new purchases in 2017 to focus on organic growth instead, but the pattern had already been set. The fastest way for a founder to realize the value of a brewery is very often not to keep running it. It's to sell the label to someone who already owns the trucks. Neither of those payouts requires a single additional barrel of beer to be brewed. That's the mechanism. That's where the real money in this industry has quietly been living the entire time. Picture a mid-size, taproom-forward brewery producing about 1,800 barrels a year, a real, plausible size for an established door-to operation, not a garage startup and not a regional giant. Rough year. A compressor failure costs a batch, foot traffic softens, and the mix skews toward distribution instead of the taproom, roughly 40% taproom, 60% wholesale. On that mix, gross margin lands around $615,000 for the year. Fixed costs, payroll, rent, insurance, the compressor repair nobody budgeted for, run close to $468,000. What's left over is about $147,000. That's the entire year's reward for the risk of ownership. Great year. The taproom is packed most weekends, a medal from the Great American Beer Festival, the industry's biggest annual awards competition, gets the local paper's attention, and the mix flips, roughly 70% taproom, 30% distribution. Gross margin on that same volume climbs to about $1,089,000. Fixed costs stay close to flat, around $428,000. What's left over is about $661,000. Same building, same tanks, same beer, more or less. The difference between the rough year and the great year is over $500,000, and almost none of that swing came from how the beer tasted. It came from which door the beer walked out of, the taproom versus distribution gap from earlier, playing out at the scale of an entire year instead of a single barrel. Now scale that gap across a 5-year hold on the real estate underneath it, and the number stops being interesting and starts being the entire reason someone like Fortress Investment Group wanted the deed in the first place. Go back to the image from the beginning, the stainless steel catching the afternoon light, the regulars leaning on the bar calling out for the usual, the name up in vinyl letters over a door that used to belong to a tire shop. All of that can still be true. People really do build that life. But the tanks, the taps, and the recipe were never really the asset worth chasing. The building underneath them was, and so was the moment someone with a much larger distribution network decided the label was worth more to them than it ever was to its founder. The beer was never really the product. The room, the real estate, and the exit were.